Well, here at the beginning, I'm going to see if we can create some distinctions. Like I've already introduced Enlightenment as a term, and then Henry, in referencing your work, I've introduced the term awakening. And one of the things I've noticed is that people often use these terms interchangeably. That sounds true, we often use them interchangeably, but perhaps they're not simply interchangeable. And perhaps each of you relates to those two words differently. And I think it would be good, just so we actually know what we're talking about with some level of clarity, if you would each describe how you use the term awakening, what you're referring to, and if you use the term enlightenment, what you're referring to.
So I must admit that I use them interchangeably these days simply because I found the term enlightenment possibly a little grand. And so these days I mostly talk about awakening, but I think I mean by it what I used to mean and what my teachers used to mean when they used the term enlightenment. There's another issue with enlightenment because in the Western tradition, it means something quite different from what it means in the kind of spirituality we're talking about. There was the Age of Enlightenment, basically the 18th century, starting in the UK especially, somewhat in continental Europe as well, somewhat even in the pre-United States, which was thinking about, new possibilities for social reform and for freedom and for the rise of science and scientific thinking over religious dogma. All of that got put under this term enlightenment in the Western tradition, which is what I grew up in. So there's a little bit of murkiness there already for me with the term enlightenment. But basically, if I just stick to the term awakening, for me, it means a couple of things above all, and then it can mean various other things, but some sense that my ordinary sense of self and its perceptions of things has been kind of superseded, has been overturned, has either vanished or somehow, I don't really like the word transcend personally, because I don't think it's about going up above. I think I've seen through it, and I've discovered that there's some other order of existence, of experience that's always been here, in which I am not separate. I'm basically not separate from anything else. And it's another order or register of experience, another dimension. Where when we taste it, we know that we've found something more real than the world and self that we had previously been kind of thoroughly convinced by. So for me, it's sort of it's got to have some sense of just discovering and having sort of break through to me that I'm not just what I thought I was. I'm part of something much larger, and I'm inseparable from it.
I usually don't use the word enlightenment. I avoid it, mostly because when I first encountered it in the Buddhist perspective, where enlightenment meant Buddhahood. And I don't claim to know Buddhahood, so I avoid the word enlightenment completely. Awakening makes more sense to me. Many people use awakening or realization. And I agree with Henry. Awakening means recognizing what we are that is not the usual self, that there's more to us or something different about us. That is, because the usual self is our psychology and physicality and sense of personality that we developed throughout history, while our awakening is recognition that we have what I call true nature. I don't use the word Buddha nature, I use true nature. So true nature means recognizing I have a realness to me that is beyond the history that I'm aware of. that is beyond the physical and the mental and all that. This is just pure awareness, sense of beingness and awareness, and the consciousness that knows itself by being itself, and that is beyond anything that happens, not emotional, not mental, not physical. And so it is a discovery. For me, in the beginning, it was quite a discovery. Big difference. Changed my life. Changed my life. Now I don't have a life. It's just nature. I mean, my experience is more like, reality just happens. Things happen. Things are done, So awakening, that's one thing, bring us to the very heart of the discussion. It is not just one thing. We don't just wake up once. I didn't have just one awakening and continued forever. It wasn't like that. The awakening was the beginning. What I call true nature, which is our essential, fundamental, inherent nature, has many ways it can show itself, which is, I think, why there are so many teachings, so many traditions, each one talking about their recognition of the true self or true nature. Which, when you study the tradition, you see they're not exactly talking about the same thing, or there are many similarities. And so in time, at the beginning, I thought it was the same thing, because you remember toward the end of the 20th century, there was a view that different teaching are talking about the same thing differently. And I first believed that, but then I recognized, no, from my experience, they're not talking about the same thing. There are similarities, different faces of the same thing, but it's not the same thing. That's why it's not just different in language. It's actually different in experience, which for me opened up things, made things more interesting even. Not before.
Well, Hameed, I think that's okay. There's so much to talk about here, but I think you're making a very important point. And I would say with 90% of the conversations I have with authors and teachers, that sounds true, along with our staff, everybody's always trying to collapse everything to say that everybody's saying the same thing. These are all roads leading to the same mountaintop. And whenever I disagree, everyone's like, wow, aren't you the downer? You don't really, come on. But I think you're making a very important point, Hameed. I wonder, Henry, if you have a comment about that.
I completely agree. I think, that idea, many paths, one mountain, I see it as many paths, one mountain range. And there are different, so I think of reality, true nature, original nature, Buddha nature, as it's a sort of, it's a jewel, it's a prism, and it has different faces. And typically traditions focus on one of those faces. Mostly they go all in on one, maybe not exclusively. Some may be more open to a few dimensions. So I think, so we can talk about different faces of awakening in different ways. One is, what is the actual nature of reality, the best that we can know it? On that sort of ultimate level, it shows itself in different ways. And we could talk about some of those ways, sure, but then absolutely, as Hameed was saying, it never stops being a process itself. It's actually, even while we may say it's unchanging, it's also constantly unfolding. There's a Taoist idea that it's blazing forth all the time. It's erupting out of nothing, creating this moment which is ever changing. But there's something perhaps unknowable, or perhaps experienceable yet unknowable, which is not changing. We could come to that. I'd love to discuss that at some point if we can. But our own understanding of it is continually evolving. I mean, Dogen said, he's got this beautiful line. You might well know it. It's quite short, so I'll just say it. to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened, is to have the body and mind of self and other drop away. To have that body and mind of self and other drop away is to be awakened by the 10,000 things,
Yeah.
and the traceless awakening. This traceless awakening goes on forever.
Yeah.
An awakening without trace goes on forever.